Hello and welcome to Let the Bird Fly, a podcast about living freely in a world given back to us. This is Wade and Mike doing part two. We're recording two videos today of Words to Know. We just did Covenant. Encourage you maybe to listen to that one or watch that one first, but you'll be fine if you watch this first and go back. But the first one was Covenant, and now we want to talk promise. Words you should know, promise. And I think sometimes this is... grace is a great word, faith is a great word, peace is a great word, mercy. But for understanding how God relates to us, I sometimes think this is the most helpful word, this word, promise.
And you may be thinking, I already know what a promise is, but I think there's some depth there too.
Yeah, for sure. Because if you've ever had to relate to someone based on promise, they've promised something, and maybe think of a time someone's promised you something and you really needed them to come through. This was an important promise. There's two things you can do with it. You can trust it, or you cannot trust it. And you do that on the basis of if you trust the person giving it, or don't trust them. And so the fact that God deals with us with promises, and already in Genesis, right? Genesis 3, that's the start of it, this promise. Although God had promised already before that. If God deals with us with promise, then grace and faith fall in. Right? Justification by grace through faith. Because if God deals with me with promise, then there's only one thing I can do, and that by God's power, trust it, or by my own power, not trust it. Which drives home then our relationship with God is a relationship of faith. So Paul gets his great thesis in Romans 1:17. The just, or the righteous, shall live by faith. Michael, what comes to mind when I said we're going to talk promise as the scriptures use it?
Yeah, so I like to think about promise word, so I write it down, promise dash word, like a compound there, and the reason for that is this is a different kind of word. There's lots of words out there. You can hear a university hall lecture. You can hear encouragement. You can hear. I can give somebody a pat on the back with some affirming words.
Rebuke.
You can rebuke. You can have law. You can have scolding. You can have all these things. What's God's primary word to us is a promise word, and what we mean by that is it does something, right? This word is not about the promise. It is the promise. And so it's active. And we've talked about this a lot with St. Paul's words in Romans 1, where he talks about this is the gospel to save. It is the gospel is the power to save. I like to say it's got some juice. It can move, right? The word's got something to it. So his promise word does something. It is active. It is not about something, right? Now, theoretically, all promises are they do something, right? They're promising that the action would be done, right?
Yeah.
It's not here's the word end. This has a future attached to it, dare I say, an eschatological nature to it.
Yeah.
Right? The promise is doing something. And as you said, all promises may not fulfill that or fulfill that, but God's promises will be fulfilled. He hasn't let us down yet. So then when I think about all the other promise words that I come across in my day-to-day life, they stink.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like when Mike sends like a form and says like, hey, Wade, need you to do this, and I'm like, oh, yep, I will.
And then
I will get it done tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And then I know full well I'm not going to, but
I know full well, and we just have this nice little
Mike does not
relationship,
trust the promise.
and I don't call you out on it.
No.
I just don't trust it.
And sometimes
right?
he just does it himself. Yeah.
So here's the thing too, is when you look at especially the Old Testament, and you were really good at articulating this, Wade, is you have, if you wanted to sum up the whole Old Testament, you can do this in a number of ways. One is, it's the whole Old Testament and New Testament is God trying to give the righteousness back to us that Adam and Eve lost.
Yeah.
But a part of that is the whole Old Testament is people trying to help along God's promise. They don't trust him. Or the whole Old Testament is people making promises to God.
Yeah.
And our promises to God stink. So I really think this changes your prayer life. I mean, take a look at your last few prayers, and and ask yourself, how many promises did I make to God? Stop it. Stop making promises to God. You don't need to. It's the other way around, right? It is to rely on his promise to you. Our lives are full of promises. Most of them stink.
The promises to speak to God are his own promises to you, right? He gives you promises for you to speak. I mean, that's what the Lord's Prayer is. The Lord's Prayer is not requests. They're commands, but they're based on promise. You're speaking back to him things he has promised.
This would be a good blog article or something to think about, like, think about the levels of promises we have.
Watch this guy across the hall, Jason. Watch this, and he's going to write something for 15, 17 on this now.
So the promise, we make promises individually to each other. I'm going to do the dishes. We make promises, legal promises. I will pay this mortgage on the 15th of every month. But we also have, like, maybe our nation state says, here's the promise of America. But I think
social contract
stuff from within parties. And then we also have, like, kind of philosophical ones, like the promises of modernity were going to be, we would fix all our problems, that kind of stuff. And we wake up into this new age, and we realize part of the things that drive us and our discontent right now is that the promises of modernity went unfulfilled.
Yeah.
Right? And these are all promises that we make to each other or to ourselves, collectively or individually, and they all stink.
Yeah.
So quit making promises to God and just rely on his promise to you.
And the nature of God's promises, too, a fun thing in the Old Testament is, for instance, what is called the prophetic perfect, where God makes a promise in the past tense, like it's as good as done. I usually think of it as when you just have like a pure shooter in basketball, and they're just on fire, and they shoot the three, and they just turn and they run down the court because they know it's going in.
The announcer says already before, yeah.
Yeah, and God in this way, God himself, who exists outside of time and foresees all things, foreknows all things, and works accordingly. We don't have that ability. We only exist within time. Yeah. But God, when the time had fully come, God sent his son, right? This, when the time was ripe for the promise to reach its fulfillment. And so this also should be what those of you who are in the pews are expecting to hear in preaching, is a lot of promises, and promises about a specific thing, right? Promises relating to your salvation, promises of mercy, of forgiveness, and promises that are rooted in Christ, right? Because this is how God still relates. We have to sometimes believe those promises against the very things that we see around us, or even more within us. John says God is greater than our hearts. We sometimes have to believe against ourselves. But that's the nature of things, is faith clinging to those promises, which means at times faith is going to be struggling. Faith is going to be, David Foster Wallace has a great line that everything he ever has loved has claw marks on it. And he means, of course, we claw to hold on to these things, and then we lose the joy of them. But with God's promises should have claw marks on them, as the Spirit, right? We can't do it on our own. Paul says the Spirit intercedes for us with sighs and groans. But those promises are what we hold to. Luther says faith is the beggar's hands, and what it holds on to is Christ. Christ in his word of promise. Anything else you got with that, Michael?
No, just to say once again that the promise, that's the core of the gospel, that it is something given to you, and it is not conditional. If there's a condition, then it's not really a promise anymore. Then it's a contract that he has made with you, and the relationship has changed. But so quit making promises to God.
Yeah,
he doesn't need them.
And hear his, and you might just find when you start doing that, when you listen to his promises and you speak his own promises back to him, which is what the Psalms do. I mean, that's just the Psalms. You might just find yourself letting the bird fly.